So hi students, welcome to this session of INI-CET July 2021 Pediatric Recall Questions. After asking the students, I've tried to assimilate these questions together. We have tried a level best to make these questions as near to the actual questions that were asked in the exams as possible. We have tried to add as many choices that we could get after the students recollected those questions. So we have tried to make these questions as much as actual questions, near to the actual questions as possible. Let us see the questions and their answers, and let us get some explanation of a few of those questions in a little detail. Now, question number 1 was a question which was on possibly Wilms tumor. Now, the question that I could get from the students is that the question said a child with ballotable abdominal mass with a history of hematuria which resolved after 2 days. So investigations was the question that was asked. What are the investigations you would like to do in such a case? There were some students who said the investigations that was asked was the best investigation, while there were others who said this was a multiple choice question. Anyway, considering that they were asking a child who is presenting with a ballotable. Now, what is a ballotable mass? A ballotable mass is a mass which is a palpable abdominal mass, a palpable mass which can be moved up and down. Now, this ballotable abdominal mass, if it occurs in children and there is a history of hematuria, there can be many differential diagnoses. But based upon the choices that they possibly gave, I can think of this possible mass to be a case of Wilms tumor. Now, Wilms tumor normally has different types of presentations in young children. The most common presentation of a Wilms tumor in young children is possibly an asymptomatic abdominal mass, incidentally found during examination. Another important presentation of Wilms tumor is that it can present with hypertension. It can also sometimes present with abdominal pains, and a painless hematuria is another common presentation of Wilms tumor, as was happening possibly in this child. Now, whenever a child or Wilms tumor presents to you, or a suspected Wilms tumor presents to you, there are different investigations you will like to do. Laboratory investigations in Wilms tumor will probably show you the findings of thrombocytosis, probably will show you show you polycythemia, will probably show you increased partial thromboplastin time. But imaging happens to be possibly the best way to diagnose Wilms tumor in children. The standard imaging technique that has been used and has successfully been able to identify the extent of the Wilms tumor, the size, the spread, that standard investigation technique or imaging technique is the CT abdomen. Usually X-ray abdomen has also been used, and even sonographies have been used. On ultrasounds, you can often see areas of hemorrhages, areas of necrosis. But ultrasound with Doppler can be quite reliable, and ultrasound with Doppler can be quite reliable in helping you find out the extension, particularly of the thrombus. And in cases of Wilms tumor, it is quite frequent to see the extension of the thrombus in the renal veins and in the inferior vena cava. So both ultrasound as well as an ultrasound with Doppler can help you in identifying the disease, that is the Wilms tumor, the size of the Wilms tumor, and also the spread of the Wilms tumor and the thrombus. However, the standard technique which is used to define this condition, the standard imaging technique that has been used to define this condition, is the CT abdomen. So CT abdomen can not only reliably define this abdominal mass, the Wilms tumor, but can also tell you its size, can also tell you areas of necrosis, can also tell you the spread, metastatic spread, especially of Wilms tumor. Wilms tumors very commonly metastasizes to areas such as the lungs. Then it can also go to areas such as the livers, and also to the area such as the lymph nodes. So lymph nodes, liver, lungs, these are very commonly areas where the metastasis of Wilms tumor spreads to. Although MRIs have been utilized in many other conditions and can reliably diagnose a number of disorders, but because of the disadvantage that MRI utilizes sedation, that is why MRI, especially for this condition, is not used, because Wilms tumor usually occurs at an age group which is quite a young age group, and MRIs requiring sedation probably will not be a good idea to be utilized frequently in young children. Therefore, CT abdomen happens to be the investigation of choice for finding the tumor, the extent of the tumor, the spread of the tumor, including the metastasis. Even PET scan is also very helpful in not only identifying the regional spread but also the metastatic spread of this tumor. Regarding fine needle aspiration cytology, FNAC. Well, FNAC is a technique that is not very commonly used, but it can be performed especially before chemotherapy to diagnose this condition. However, if you compare FNAC with core needle biopsies usually are avoided in these cases and are usually limited to only select cases, particularly where the findings are the findings which make the diagnosis or establishing the diagnosis very difficult. So whenever you have some unusual imaging findings, whenever you have some unusual pathological findings, in those cases core needle biopsies may be required. Otherwise, fine needle aspiration cytology possibly is used more commonly in comparison to core needle biopsies. Now, among the choices that students gave me, CT abdomen possibly was definitely one of the choice. PET was one of the choice. FNAC and needle biopsies, they could not confirm whether FNAC was actually one of the choice or a needle biopsy, a core needle biopsy was one of the choice. As I've told you, in case FNAC was one of the choice, FNACs can also be done, especially before chemotherapies, to identify the disease. However, if core needle biopsies was what one of the choices was, then definitely this is not the answer, because core needle biopsies, as I told you, are reserved only for very select cases where there are atypical findings. Vanillyl mandelic acid is VMA. The choice D is metabolite of catecholamines and is usually utilized more for finding out disorders or as a biomarker for disorders such as neuroblastomas rather than for Wilms tumor. So this definitely is not one of them. So definitely A and B are definitely one of the two of the best choices to consider in this case, in case this is multiple choice. And as I told you, in case FNAC was one of the choices, then FNAC can also be taken, although FNAC is not written usually in all books, but fine needle aspiration cytology can be performed before chemotherapy in these cases and is much more frequently utilized in comparison to core needle biopsies. However, if core needle biopsies was the third choice, then definitely core needle biopsies are not routinely done in cases of Wilms tumor. See, histopathology of Wilms tumor or biopsies of Wilms tumor usually are done in majority of cases when nephrectomies are being done. Initial diagnosis always is established by imaging. So therefore, CT abdomen and PET scans would be the best. In case FNAC was asked, I would say FNAC can also be utilized in Wilms tumor diagnosis. But yes, in case core needle biopsies was asked, definitely the answer should be only A and B. D definitely is not utilized in the diagnosis of Wilms tumor. In case the one single best answer was asked, in that case, according to me, the one single best answer should be CT abdomen. Best way to identify Wilms tumor, to define the tumor, define the size of the tumor, see for areas of necrosis and hemorrhage, and also for finding out the metastatic spread of the disorder or the disease. Question number 2 was on intersusception. Now, intersusception is the complication which is seen with which vaccine? This possibly was the question asked. Choices that were given were the measles vaccine, possibly, polio vaccine, again possibly, rotavirus vaccine, and oral typhoid vaccine. Again, this is based upon whatever the students have recalled. Now, this we have discussed in our eGurukul notes also. I have in my videos also, eGurukul video also I have discussed about, and this is a direct snapshot that has been taken from our eGurukul pediatric video, wherein we have a very clearly discussed that intussusception is a condition which is primarily associated as a side effect with rotavirus vaccine. See, rotavirus vaccines usually are the vaccines which are given in young children to protect against rotavirus, especially the invasive rotavirus gastroenteritis, which can be associated with significantly high morbidities and mortalities. The rotavirus vaccines which are currently being used in India, well, we have the human monovalent rotavirus vaccine, Rotarix. Then we have the human bovine pentavalent rotavirus vaccine, which is Rotatec. Then we have the vaccine which was introduced, I think, in 2016 in India. The vaccine which is based upon the 116E neonatal strain, which is known as the Rotavac. And then we have the Rotaseal vaccine, which was, I think, introduced in India in 2018. The first licensed rotavirus vaccine which was introduced by the name of Rotashield actually had to be withdrawn from the market because of the problems of intussusception that were frequently associated with that vaccine. These vaccines, rotavirus vaccines which are currently in use, are much safer. And the incidence of intussusception associated with these rotavirus vaccines, actually, to be very frank, is very limited. Very rare side effect of intussusception associated with these vaccines. However, you cannot totally discount this side effect. It can occur, although very rarely. According to statistics, intussusception can occur about 3 to 14 days after giving the rotavirus vaccine. And the overall incidence of intussusception with rotavirus vaccine, I think, is 1 to 2 cases per 1 million doses, per 1 lakh doses, which itself speaks how rare intussusception is associated with rotavirus vaccines. However, if there are choices given like this, possibly intussusception is maximally associated out of these vaccines with the rotavirus vaccine. So answer should be definitely C. Then question number 3. Again, this is a question we have very frequently discussed in our run up to these INI-CET exams also. And while we have been taking our classes, I've been taking my classes, I've frequently discussed about this in COVID management in children. In fact, my last videos about COVID management in children, I very clearly told you what, according to the recent guidelines also, is the indications of giving steroids in COVID infection in children. See, COVID infection can be divided up into an asymptomatic COVID infection in children. It can be divided into mild, moderate, then and severe infections. The use of corticosteroids is very limited, especially in children, and it has been limited only to moderate COVID illnesses where there are signs of deteriorating illness. And for all severe COVID infections, steroids are standardly used. Dexamethasone, for example, 0.15 milligrams per kg, maximum dose of 6 milligrams for about 5 to 14 days, has been used and has been found to be very successful in reducing down the severity of severe COVID infections, and especially its progression to complications such as ARDS and shock. Apart from steroids, remdesivir, as I told you, the recent DGHS guidelines, and this again in my last video I have told, the remdesivir antiviral has not been recommended. In fact, the recent DGHS guidelines clearly state till the age of 18 years, remdesivir should not be used in any form of COVID infection in children. Regarding ivermectin, there was a role of ivermectin as a prophylactic agent also to prevent COVID infections or a severe COVID infection, and there was a role in the treatment of COVID infection also in the past. However, there is no strong data to recommend it for the management of COVID infection and is not recommended for management of COVID infection in children. So therefore, for the treatment of severe COVID illness in children, the best answer here should be B, that is the use of steroids. Dexamethasone you can use, or you can use methylprednisolone. Dexamethasone, I told you the dose that is recommended is usually 0.15 milligrams per kg per dose, a maximum of 6 milligrams per dose, twice daily, given for a period of 5 to 14 days. And you obviously have to taper it down. But This is one of the drugs that has been associated with significant reduction in morbidities and mortality, especially in severe COVID infections. For moderate illness, it was utilized in the past, but now they say for moderate COVID infection, it should be used only when there are signs of deteriorating illness. Right? So this should answer question number 3. So this is also something which we have discussed in our classes, especially in our COVID management presentations, two COVID management presentations that I gave on children. That I have, both the presentations I've discussed about the role of steroids in COVID infections. Coming to question number 4. Now question number 4 again is a question which students were not able to inform me about all the choices, but based upon whatever I could get from the recall that was done by the students, which of the following is correct for components of kangaroo care? So they say choice A was a skin to skin contact, prevention of infection and exclusive breastfeeding, while choice B was a skin to skin contact, exclusive breastfeeding, early discharge. Plus choice C and D were again combinations of things similar to this. But again, in my eGurukul pediatric video, I very clearly, this is again a snapshot from that eGurukul pediatric video, we have very clearly defined what is kangaroo mother care and what are the components of kangaroo mother care. So kangaroo care is a standard of care for low birth weight babies especially. There are 3 important components of kangaroo care, which include skin to skin contact, early initiation of breastfeeding, so exclusive breastfeeding, this is very importantly exclusive breastfeeding, and timely discharge from the hospital and continuation of this breastfeeding at home. So these are the 3 components of kangaroo care. So therefore B should be the best answer. Skin to skin contact, exclusive breastfeeding, which should be started early, and early discharge and continuation of this breastfeeding at home. One should not confuse kangaroo care from a skin to skin contact, which usually is recommended for all babies. So what you can say is that kangaroo care is a more prolonged and a sustained form of a skin to skin contact in comparison to the routine skin to skin contact we recommend for all babies. This kangaroo care is better suited for low birth weight babies. Again, in my classes, I have told that this is very important for babies who are more than 1.8 kgs and who are stable babies. So because I said they are recommended for low birth weight babies, they are all babies who are above 1.8 kgs and up to 2.5 kgs and who are hemodynamically stable can be provided kangaroo care. And kangaroo care is a form of a prolonged and sustained skin to skin contact. Minimum of 1 hour interval of skin to skin contact is necessary. So it's a form of a prolonged skin to skin contact. So therefore for question number 4, the best answer was B, skin to skin contact, exclusive breastfeeding, early discharge. And this is also a question that has directly been asked from our notes, which we discussed in our eGurukul pediatric videos. Question number 5 was on pentavalent vaccine. Again, in my eGurukul pediatric video, which is in the immunization chapter, the vaccination chapter, the last chapter, we have very clearly discussed about the pentavalent vaccines. So pentavalent vaccine is a vaccine which includes 5 antigens. DPT, then it includes hepatitis B, and it includes Haemophilus influenza B. So pentavalent vaccine is a combination of DPT, hepatitis B and Haemophilus influenza B. Basically, it's a form of a combined vaccine which is always recommended because the overall adherence to vaccination is always good if combination vaccines are given together, rather than giving the child separate injectables in the form of a DPT separate injectable, hepatitis B separate injectable and Hep separate injectable. You're giving all the 3 in the form of one single injectable vaccine and does not require any reconstitution. It is given in the form of doses at 6, 10 and 14 weeks in the national immunization schedule and can be given up till the age of 1 year. So pentavalent vaccine, which again is a thing that we have discussed in our notes, the best answer is choice A. Coming to question number 6. Now question number 6 was a child with itchy hyperpigmented plaques and exudation which is seen on the elbows and on the knee flexures. Now either this can be told by our dermatology colleagues who can explain this much better, but since this is a question which is related to a common dermatological problem seen in children, so I decided to take it in my video. Probably the dermatologist will be able to tell this better. This is typically a case of atopic dermatitis. As you must be knowing very well, atopic dermatitis is a type of eczema. There are recurrent itchy rashes or lesions that appear symmetrically usually over different parts of the body. It can occur in the form of an acute atopic dermatitis, and many times they can be chronic atopic dermatitis lesions also, which can be present especially in older children. In infancy, atopic dermatitis typically will present with papillovesicular rashes. So it will typically present with papillovesicular rashes, which are particularly commonly seen over the face, and sometimes they are seen over the neck. And they are very, very itchy. Itchiness is very commonly seen in these cases. On the other hand, in older children, this occurs more commonly in the form of lichenified plaques, which often can be crusty and have crusts seen over their surfaces, and they very commonly are present over the antecubital fossa and the popliteal fossa. So that's the typical area that was given here. So because of these two things, one is itchy plaques, second is present over the elbows and the knee flexures. This is a typical presentation that is seen in older children who have atopic dermatitis. So therefore, according to me, the best answer here is atopic dermatitis. Probably our dermatology colleagues will be able to explain this condition better to you. But whatever patients we see, we normally treat them using topical agents, particularly topical corticosteroids. We normally ask the mothers to clean the babies or use soaps which are more pH friendly soaps, pH friendly for the skin. Sometimes in case the lesions do not respond to topical corticosteroids, topical immunomodulators such as tacrolimus can also be applied on these lesions. In fact, there have been people who have been using, rather than using topical corticosteroids twice daily, they use topical corticosteroids in the morning and topical immunomodulators in the evening. So once daily, both of them. Because obviously these topical immunomodulators, they act as steroid sparing agents. So that is one of the major advantages. And these agents need to be given for long periods of time, steroids. So hence, in these cases, topical immunomodulators can either be used alone or can often be mixed with topical corticosteroids. Mixed means one given in the morning, one given in the evening. To reduce down the itchiness, many times oral antihistamines can also be used, especially in young children because of the problems of pruritus, itchiness. Oral antihistamines can be used. We frequently use oral antihistamines in our patients who come to us with atopic dermatitis. Those lesions which are lichenified lesions and those lesions which have crusted, in those cases often moisturizers or even emollients can be applied. Petroleum jellies can be applied over the skin. So this is overall a presentation of atopic dermatitis, and therefore based upon whatever the question I could get after the students recalled it, itchiness and particularly lesions present over the elbow and the knee flexures typically goes in favor of an atopic dermatitis. So this is a little tricky question. Students were not able to actually tell me exactly what that question was. But the question was something like, which of the following is a true statement about cytomegalovirus congenital infection? So this was about congenital infections. Some of the choices that I could get was about 20 to 30 CMV infections are symptomatic. triad of sensorineural hearing loss, calcifications, possibly enamel hyperplasias. Most children are asymptomatic at birth and can develop sensorineural hearing loss later in life. And if mother has IgG positive for CMV, then child is unlikely to develop infection. Now, to be very frank, to be able to answer the question, it's very difficult unless and until you exactly know the choices that were asked in the exams. But cytomegalovirus, definitely congenital CMV, again from our eGurukul notes, we have discussed all of this. It's one of the most common congenital infections. In fact, I would say it is the most common congenital infections that is seen in children. Almost 90% children who have congenital CMV infections are usually asymptomatic. Only 10% children of congenital CMV are symptomatic. When the symptoms are present, the symptoms are those of IUGR, symptoms are those of microcephaly, symptoms can be those of calcifications, periventricular calcifications, symptoms can be those of jaundice. In about 5% cases, chorioretinitis can appear. So these are probably the symptoms that are seen in patients who have symptomatic disease. Otherwise, 90% children who have congenital CMV infections, they are asymptomatic. So in case I go by the questions that the students have recalled, and choice A, they said somewhere about 20 to 30% CMV infections are symptomatic. This was what was given. I think then this should be wrong, because only about 10% children are symptomatic, remaining almost 90% children are asymptomatic. Triad of sensorineural hearing loss, calcifications, enamel hyperplasias. Well, this triad is not typically seen in cases of CMV infections, especially enamel hyperplasias being co-associated with sensorineural hearing loss. Yes, this is right that sensorineural hearing loss is one of the most common long-term sequelae of congenital CMV infection. But to say this triad is typically seen in children, according to me, this should also be wrong. Now, most children asymptomatic at birth can develop sensorineural hearing loss later in life. Again, how this statement was framed, I'm not very sure. But although sensorineural hearing loss can develop in many patients, in fact, there are reports that about 10% of infected children means children who are infected with CMV. 10% of these children, they go on to develop sensorineural hearing loss. And the funny part is that many of these children in the initial hearing test, they can actually pass the initial hearing test. So when, for example, otoacoustic emission test is done, they can pass the test. Later on, then sensorineural hearing loss develops or deafness develops in these children. So a high degree of suspicion also needs to be maintained when you have to diagnose the sensorineural hearing loss in these children. They need to be routinely examined with follow-ups for deafness in these cases. But to say that most children who are asymptomatic with CMV, they go on to develop sensorineural hearing loss, if this is the exact statement, I think it is not correct. Regarding the mother has IgG positive for CMV, child is unlikely to develop infection. Well, whether it is unlikely or it was less likely, if in case the question was less likely to develop the infections, then yes, I think this can be the correct answer. See, the rate of congenital infection or rate of infection in the fetus, rate of infection, CMV infection in the fetus from a mother who has a primary CMV infection, that rate of infection usually is about 30%. But in mothers who actually were immune to CMV, all those mothers who are immune to CMV, or a mother who probably has an IgG for CMV, that she had a CMV in the past, in those cases probably the rate of infection is much less. The rate of infection in fetus in some cases, such cases, we call it as non-primary infections. In those cases, the risk of non-primary infections is just about 1 to 2%. Although overall in the community, if you see, the number of women who probably are immune, had CMV in the past and now immune to CMV, that whole number, absolute number may be huge. So actually speaking, if you see the absolute number of children who develop this infection from non-primary maternal infection, that number may be significant. significantly high. But overall, if you compare it case to case, if you compare what is the risk of infection in the fetus from a maternal primary infection and what is the risk of infection in a fetus from a maternal non-primary infection. That means when there is a mother who is immune to this previous infection it has occurred, then I think overall the risk will be much less from non-primary infection in comparison to a primary infection. Primary infection, the risk is much higher. So therefore, again, this is, I really do not know if these are exactly the choices, what the question exactly was. But according to what questions and choices have been presented to me, I feel out of A, B, C, D, possibly D should be the best answer. Once I exactly get what the question was, what the choices, what probably that choices and answer may change. But right now, probably the best answer is D. Sensorineural hearing loss, there is no doubt about this fact that it's the most common long-term sequelae of this infection. Diagnosis can always be made by culturing the virus or isolating the virus within the first 2 to 3 weeks from specimens such as urine, saliva. IgM assays have been used, however, according to current data, they are not very reliable. IgM CMV assays have been used, but they are not very reliable. Treatment has been with ganciclovir, particularly when there is deafness or when there is prolonged neurological illness. So only those newborns who have prolonged neurological illness or who have deafness as a sequelae of CMV infections developing, in those cases ganciclovir may be recommended. Question number 8, the last question which I could get from the students. The most common cause of death in children between 1 to 4 years of age. So under 5 mortality is what they were primarily asking, and this, I think there is a graph which is given in OP Ghai also, where they are discussing about some common causes of under 5 mortality in children. Causes of under 5 mortality in children. Again, there are certain students who are saying that certain timeline was given, probably a 2013 timeline. I again do not know what exactly was the question, but based upon whatever has been given in by the students, the recalled question by the students, I can tell you that the most common cause possibly of under 5 mortality in children, usually first overall most common, is prematurity related complications, which is not the choice here. So prematurity related complications in fact account for almost around, I would say, a quarter of all deaths in children below the age of 5 years. But yes, ARIs or pneumonias happen to be possibly the next most common cause of mortalities, occurring in almost about 13% cases. Followed closely by diarrheas. Even diarrheas are very common cause of mortality in under 5 children, probably occurring in about 10 to 11% of total cases. Then other neonatal problems such as neonatal infections, such as hypoxic ischemic encephalopathies, even they are known to account for about 11% to 12% mortality. So they are also significant causes of mortalities in under 5 children. But since we are talking about 1 to 4 years of age group, let us talk more about pneumonias and diarrheas, because we are not talking about newborns and newborn related complications here. So pneumonias, I would say 13%, diarrheas, I would say 10%. Then injuries account for about 3% of all mortalities. And malaria, according to these reports, account for about 1% of all mortalities. So if you have to arrange them in a sequence, starting from the most common to the least common, the most common should be pneumonias, followed by diarrheas, followed by injuries, followed by malaria. This should be the sequence of mortalities of these 4 primary diseases that were asked in the exam. And the most common was pneumonias or ARIs, accounting for maximum mortalities among these, followed by diarrheas, then injuries, and then least common cause of mortality is malaria. So these are the questions that I could get from the students, and based upon whatever recalled questions I could get, I've given the possible answers for these questions. Again, as I say, if the questions language change, if the options change, then obviously the answers can also change. But based upon what I could get from the students, these are the possible 8 questions. We have been asking the students to possibly take some time out and think over if there are any other pediatric questions that were asked. In case I get more questions, I get better framed questions, then possibly we can come up with a second session, which will be a more reliable session. But at least at the outset, these were the 8 important pediatric questions and their answers based upon the recall by the students. I hope you have found this session useful, and you will be able to judge yourself how you fared in these 8 questions in the exams. And those who could not for any reason get the correct answer for any of those questions, you could identify why was the answer wrong and what was the explanation for the correct answer. So thank you very much. I hope you found this session useful. Thank you very much and goodbye.